Hello, everyone. This is a demonstration of soldering techniques. And specifically what we're going to be doing is building a fused jumper wire. A fused jumper wire is used to make connections when you're diagnosing or experimenting, and it gives you the added protection of having an inline fuse in case you connect something wrong or your experiment doesn't go as planned. The materials we have is a inline fuse holder, which we're going to install a 10 amp fuse in. We've got a what was a jumper wire singular that didn't have a fuse in it, and we're going to install a fuse in this wire here. We've got some heat shrink tubing that I've already cut to length here for purposes. We've got some wire strippers, some side cutters, a flame tool, some rosin core solder, and a soldering pencil, what's referred to as a soldering pencil. This is a 40-watt soldering pencil. It gets very hot, and I like using it with soldering, but there are 25-watt soldering pencils out there, which may be better as you're learning. So we're going to start by assembling the wire. I'm going to cut this inline fuse in half. I'm going to strip the ends. This happens to be 14 gauge wire, so I'm going to line it up in the 14 gauge slot, squeeze, and then push with my thumb to pull off that insulation. Give it a light twist. Strip this other end. Give it a light twist. And we're also going to strip the ends of this wire. This is, I think, 18 gauge wire, if I'm not mistaken. It's older wire, so I can't really see what gauge it is. Feels pretty thin. I think it's 18 gauge. I think I should actually do this one a little longer area that's stripped off. Okay, so we're going to put a little heat shrink tubing over the ends here where this wire is screwed on to the clamp. So I'm going to put this heat shrink tubing up there, and I'll heat it up later. And I'm also going to put it on the other end. I'm going to put some heat shrink tubing for my soldering joints onto this wire. And in order to attach them, we're going to do give the wires a little twist. This actually ended up a little too long. And we put them together in an X like this. And then you place your fingers on either side and just sort of twist in opposite directions. Like so. And what you want to end up with is a tightly twisted connection that is as small as possible, so you can make a nice soldering joint connection. I'm going to put this in our soldering clamps, which I didn't mention earlier. But this holds your work while you're doing the soldering. And I'm going to see if I can't get this camera just a little closer. So my soldering gun's plugged in, it's already heated up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a light force against the bottom of my work here to start transferring the heat. Before I do that, I'm going to what they call tin the end, T-I-N. Give it just a little bit of solder on the end. And what that does is that helps the heat transfer to my work. I'm going to expand this solder out also here. The gun is super hot, and the solder, once it gets melted, is super hot. And all that heat will transfer you to your skin if you happen to get a drop of this on your skin. So it'll burn pretty deeply. So you want to be super, super careful. Now what I'm going to do is I'm adding a little bit of solder to help the heat transfer into the wire. Once the heat transfers into the wire, I'm just going to sort of paint the wire with the solder. And the solder will sink in between the wires and fill everything up. There you go, it's already hot enough. I want to do this kind of quickly. And I hold the gun on there just for a minute to help the solder transfer. And pull it away. Your insulation gets pretty hot. And as much as possible, you want to try and keep it from melting the insulation. We'll let that cool just a little bit, because when we push our heat shrink tubing up onto it, it's going to immediately start to melt that tubing, and we don't want it to do that early. We'll go ahead and solder the other connection. I want you to notice this soldering joint. It's not much bigger than the wire itself. So when we put the heat shrink tubing on it, it'll seal nicely. I actually think we can go ahead and do that now. And this makes it squeeze down tightly against the soldering joint, makes it nice and clean. We can also heat this end up. Okay, and we'll do this one more time on the other end. You want these two ends that you've stripped back to be basically equal. Keep an eye on that soldering pencil. You sure don't want it to slip and burn you. So whenever one end is longer than the other, you want to trim off that excess. So we'll give these a light twist, put them in an X, and give them an opposite twist. Put it in our soldering clamps. Have some excess solder. I'm gonna get something to take that off. Best thing to use is a wet sponge. I don't have any water handy here, so I'm just going to use this paper towel. Wipe it clean. Okay, and again, we're going to heat up we're going to get a little bit of solder on the end here. Then we're going to heat up our work. As you heat up the work, you can add a little bit of solder in the little V between the work and your gun and that will help the heat transfer to the wire. And pretty quickly, there you see, I can already melt the solder into the wire. And I don't have to move my soldering gun, I just move the wire. I'm sorry, I moved the solder. And that's about it for soldering. The thing to remember is to get your heat shrink tubing on there before you assemble your work. Add the solder, melt the solder onto the wire just as soon as you can. You don't want to continue to heat up the wire because it'll melt the insulation going back both directions. And just generally, if you only want to add enough solder to coat the wires. It should coat the wires, but you should still be able to see the strands of the wire where you've soldered. So that you don't want to add too much solder because then it'll be these large, glops of solder on the wire, and it just doesn't look good once you put the heat shrink tubing on it. So we're going to go ahead and slip this up on our work. And heat it up. And then we're going to heat up the heat shrink tubing here. Now, I made this look pretty easy. I've been soldering a long time. So don't get frustrated if things don't happen exactly like they did here. But this is your fuse jumper wire. And it's pretty handy for electrical diagnosis. Practice soldering, get plenty of solder so you can practice, and then just connect wires and solder them. Don't worry about all the other parts of it. Just practice soldering on several soldering joints before you attempt to solder something that you really care about. All right, that's it. I hope that was helpful as far as training is concerned. Thanks very much.